isolation membrane is essentially that peel and stick's doing two things. It's sort of a backup to our primary metal flashing, but it's also a dielectric union. It's separating the two dissimilar metals, the copper in the wood and the aluminum flashing.
Chemistry is so cool. Welcome to the Fine Homebuilding Podcast, our weekly discussion of building, remodeling, and design topics aimed at anybody who cares deeply about the craft and science of working on houses. This is Senior Editor Patrick McComb. Today I'm joined by Fine Homebuilding Editorial Director Andrew Zellner.
Good morning, Patrick.
Fine Homebuilding Editorial Advisor Mike Guertin.
Hi, Patrick.
And our fine producer Jeff Rose.
Hi there.
You can find previous podcasts and check out the show notes at finehomebuilding.com/podcast. Please email your questions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com. Well, gents, it's good to see you this morning. Thanks for being here.
Happy to be here.
Yeah,
Mike, what have you been up to? It's been a little time since we've seen each other. What's going on?
Well, the holidays have passed, and I got a little caught up in that Southwest debacle over the holidays. Luckily, I got trapped
Southwest
at
Airlines,
home.
yeah, sure.
Yeah, luckily I got trapped at home, but I didn't get to my in-laws' house down in Florida about a week late. And my father-in-law, who injured himself, he's 92, and he injured himself maybe 6 months ago. So the to-do list is stacked up a little deeper than usual when I get here. So I've been doing all kinds of things. Like my most recent one was repairing a door jam down. You know how the lower end of door jams on exterior doors, after weather gets to them and they don't have the rot-resistant jams, and they just rot out. So I was playing with Bondo and repairing the rot, which, you know, it's one of those chores or tasks where it's like, how do you know you're going to get excavate all the rot out and then prepare the surface of the rotted area, the good wood, to accept the filler, and then make sure it's got a good bond so it will last a long time. And I think in our after show, it's kind of this kind of leads into what we'll talk about in the after show, which is, how do you know when your work is done or done enough or done good enough, or what's adequate, or what level of durability and finish you're targeting, because it's a moving target for all of us. So
it varies by project, right? I think that's the nut of it, right? So what do you think a reasonable expectation for your Bondo repair is?
I think a reasonable, judging from the door and the condition of the door and the condition of that area of the back of the house, if I can get maybe 6-7 years out of it, that would be good. And then it would time for the door and the stucco in that area to be kind of chiseled out, because it's been patched a few times, and it might be good for a full rebuild.
And how long will that repair take total, Mike?
Oh, I already did it. I did it a couple days ago. It took the real process took maybe 45 minutes between chiseling out what I had to and then prepping it, and then putting the Bondo in. And I had to build forms. It was kind of weird. You don't think of forming Bondo, but it was, the bottom 5 or 6 inches of the jam. And when you put Bondo in, it just slowly droops. So I made some 1x, and then I screwed it in because it had to form an outside corner at the edge of the jam, the end of the jam to the trim. And I was thinking about it, it's like, okay, I'm going to put Bondo, which bonds to just about anything you stick it to, but I don't want it to stick to the form. So, you know how you puzzle on things for a couple seconds and you come up with a solution? And it occurred to me that like clear packing tape or like any kind of house wrap tape, it's smooth on the outside surface. So I stuck it to the board, the little form boards I was using. And then when I filled the cavity up, and before it drooped, I screwed those form boards on, the little sticks with the plastic tape on it. And 15 minutes later, I pulled them off, and I had a perfectly smooth, flat surface that just took a little light sanding, and it was done. It was amazing. So that tape, Bondo doesn't stick to tape, which is good.
All right. That's really cool. That's a great technique.
Yeah.
Jeff, have you done anything exciting on your place?
No, not at all. It's been very, very quiet.
How about you, Andrew? You told me you've been doing plumbing work, which I have great admiration for.
Yeah, so it gets cold in the winter here in Minneapolis, and I have a half bath that I've got two supply lines running to hot and cold. And when I put them in, I ran them in the joist cavity that was along the rim board, and thought I did a pretty good job of air sealing and insulating that space. And lo and behold, after the third day of like negative 30-degree wind chill here in Minneapolis, the water in that bathroom wasn't working. And so dug out a bunch of insulation, spent some time with a heat gun, getting those water lines warm backed up. It's all PEX A, so I wasn't like super concerned about, something failing catastrophically from freezing. But so I did that, and then I put it all back because it was the holidays. I didn't want to deal with it. And then 2 or 3 days later, it happened again. It still hadn't warmed up enough. And so the second time I did it, I took some more time and actually ran the supply lines over to one more cavity bay away from the wall, and then ran them back to the water heater and my main PEX manifold. And they've been fine ever since. But it was interesting because we have like a unheated back porch attached to the house at the back, and these supply lines are running along there. And so I'm betting there's some big hole that's letting a bunch of air kind of cycle through, because it was clearly frozen just in the bay, but it wasn't frozen in the supply lines up to the sink or the toilet. So yeah, that was a fun holiday project.
Did it trouble you to have to do it again, or was it just you were just resolute about the whole thing?
It didn't trouble me too much to do it again. I sort of knew, like, in the back of my mind, I was like, well, there's the fix that will get us through this next week, and there's the fix that will fix this. Yeah. And one of them involves some parts I don't have, and it's the holidays, and stuff is closed. So I fixed it in the short term, knowing I would have to go back and do this, and not realizing I have to go back and do it in a few days. So, go ahead.
The risk is that a temporary repair becomes permanent if it doesn't need to be addressed. Am I right?
Well, it comes back to that question of how good is good enough.
Yeah, exactly.
Which I think we'll have a lot of stuff to talk about. The other exciting thing that has happened here is we've gotten a ton of snow in the last 2 days. And I think we're like, our snow average over the winter is something like 54 inches, and we're already at like 45 inches.
How much do you have on the ground now?
Yeah.
Probably 12 to 15 inches. That all arrived in the last 36 hours. Oh, outside looks great. Everything's nice and quiet, feels insulated.
Yeah.
It's beautiful, but you don't want to be driving around.
Now, over the course of the winter, if you're getting upwards of 54 inches on average, and your temperatures you probably don't get that midwinter, January, early February thaw like we'll get in southern New England where Patrick and I are, that'll melt it away. So it must keep stacking up deep. Where do you get rid of the snow? Because you have a fairly small property. Do you end up kind of getting crowded in by piles of snow?
If we don't get any super warm days, it kind of feels like you're just walking through canyons, on both sides of the sidewalk. And, yeah.
Well, keep us posted on that because, I like to live vicariously through folks who get a lot of snow by this point in my life. I took some time around the holidays to wash the house with a scrub brush and tidy water, which means Tide detergent in a bucket of water and a spray bottle of bleach. And it looks so great. It is so satisfying. And then once that was all done, I took the time to wash all the windows with a Ettore rubber squeegee and a bucket of water. And Boy, it's so nice. You don't realize how distracting like filthy windows are from your outside view, right? It's really nice to have clear windows.
Was there much dirt buildup on your exterior of the house that you noticed that you could distinctly see where you'd washed and where you hadn't washed?
Oh yeah, Mike, it didn't seem that bad, like outward appearances, until you start cleaning it, and then you're like, oh, okay. A lot of algae and black mold, and for whatever reason, black mold seems to grow great on aluminum gutters and fascia in our neighborhood. And boy, that looks so much different when that stuff is clean. It really, really pops and looks so much better. Carol says we should take the photos of the house now, so in case we ever have to list it, it looks its best, even if the photos are 2 or 3 years old.
Or just Photoshop later on?
Yeah, I would tell anyone who's contemplating washing their house because it looks a little grungy. Boy, you'll feel good about it after you're done, for sure.
And I'm glad to hear you didn't use a pressure washer.
Yeah, boy, people were going to think I'm nuts to say this, but I found the process kind of enjoyable. You knew what to do every second you're doing it. I could limit my workday to a few hours because I wanted it to be above freezing, and it just made it, I don't know, a little more normal DIY instead of some crazy project that takes tens of hours or hundreds of hours to complete. It's nice. Oh boy, so we heard from our listeners on a number of subjects. I'm going to start with workwear, which was a topic of an after show. And this is from Andy Steele, who's in North Carolina. Hey, Patrick, I just listened to the after show discussion on workwear in cold climates, and I thought I would send you some of my thoughts. Despite your experience here in the North Carolina mountains last winter, we do in fact get cold weather. So I was there for a photo shoot between Christmas and New Year's. Our current 10-day forecast has lows in the single digits and highs in the teens. In terms of cold weather gear, you hit the nail on the head when you mentioned layering. I personally, like merino, will base layer tops and bottoms. On top of that, I usually wear some sort of mid-weight thermal pullover, typically with a half zipper and a vest for an outer layer if I can get away with it. If not, then a jacket is required. I like the vest because it doesn't limit mobility as much as a jacket once you have a tool belt on. I have all but abandoned my big Carhartt coat and replaced it with a Carhartt puffer jacket. I find it to be just as warm, a fraction of the weight, and much easier to move around in. So to show how ignorant I am, I didn't even know that Carhartt made, puffy coats, and I got to get one of them. They look amazing. He says, for pants, I have a mixture of TrueWork and Carhartt pants. I like the TrueWork pants a lot for their water resistance and wind resistance, but they are loud, as Andrew mentioned. Carhartt started making a line of pants called Rugged Flex a few years ago, and in my experience, they are the best pants offered by Carhartt. I like the double knee version. The cut of these pants is much more modern with slimmer legs, gusseted crotch, small tool pockets on either side that are large enough to fit a regular sized cell phone. The fabric is made with some stretch to it so you can bend and squat without showing the world your John L's. What I found to be as important as the gear itself is the manner in how you wear it. For years and years, I would get dressed at home, get in the truck, drive 30 to 45 minutes to the job, then freeze all day and finally warm up again in bed. The worst offender was my feet, which usually got cold in November and warmed again in March. Now what I do is wear as little clothing as possible on the way to the job site. I typically wear sneakers or my slippers to drive in and get to the job and change my socks, which always are some sort of wool blend, darn tough. During this process, I always dry my feet with a towel to get rid of any sweat that is accumulated on the commute. I'll typically put the top 2 shirt layers on when I get to the job site as well. The idea here is to reduce the possibility for sweating before spending the day outside in the cold. Also, tuck your tail shirts in. This would seem like common sense, but I have to tell every new employee that at least 2 times, keeping the wind from blowing up your undershirt will go a long way to making you more comfortable. Having a good hat is also important. We call them toboggans here, but I understand the rest of the world refers to them as beanies or stocking caps. I really like the ones that have an extra band of insulation or an additional layer of fabric around the part that covers your ears and has less material on the top so your head can breathe. These are also easily removable and a great way to let some excess heat out as needed. Anyways, hope You all are well, and as always, great job on the podcast. Thanks, Andy Steele. What do you guys think? I think the advice to put the gear on when you get to outside is really important. I learned that cross-country skiing, right? If you start sweating in the car and get out in the cold, it's all over. You're done for.
Exactly.
Yeah, as soon as you get sweaty and then start to cool off, it's you're done.
You're done. Any other nuggets you guys liked from Andy's email?
I like the air barrier. He brings in an air barrier there with the shirt tucked in, because that's something you don't ordinarily think about. But people who don't have to work outside on a regular basis don't think about is you have to have something that's continuous so that when you move, bend over, tip sideways, you're not getting that air getting to you, because even a slight breeze, it can blow up under those layers if they're not layered in. I even interlock. I have one t-shirt will go on first, and I have my long johns will go up. Then I have another layer goes over the long johns from my upper body. So it's like crisscross locked. And that way, if something starts to work its way out, I've got a second air barrier built in.
I can't believe we've never used the analogy of winter dressing to describe home's air barriers, right? People immediately understand if you have exposed skin, what that does to your comfort. And similarly, your house.
Yeah, you don't want to freeze your pipes.
Well, when Rick Arnold and I used to do, we got funding from our local electric utility back in the early 2000s to go into all the career tech centers in Eastern Massachusetts and Rhode Island and do trainings on energy efficient building. Because at that time it was kind of, the teachers weren't really on board. They were old school teachers. So anyway, and we'd bring in jackets and windbreakers and a fan. And we would show the difference of in the layers of clothing and what would stop that air from moving and affecting how you felt. And just putting a windbreaker on over a t-shirt was more effective than putting on, say, a layer of a poly, like a thick, fluffy poly shirt, because the air would flow right through it. So so clothing and house building do have connections.
The other thing we heard about from our listeners, and I was delighted to learn more about smartwatches. So this first one comes from Ben K. Greetings, FHB podcast crew. I always learn something while I listen, and there was finally a question that came up I hope I can help with. In episode 521, the question was raised as to which smartwatch can handle tradework. This was a question I recently had as well. Here's my problem. As a finished carpenter, like many others, I get constant texts from other crew members at my jobs, the builder, homeowners, etc. With the cost of phones, I hate having my phone in my pocket while having to climb ladders and carry material around for the constant fear I'm going to bump it on the side of my leg and break it. My previous solution was to leave my phone at my workbench. The problem was anytime I was away from my bench, I got a text, email, or call. I'd have to stop what I was doing, go back to the bench and check it. What a time waster. So the solution I came up with was this. Remember, not all smartwatches are created equal. The main purpose for me was to be able to reply to text through my watch via talk to text. While you may think this is a standard feature on all smartwatches, it is not. Most watches only allow preloaded responses. Apple and Samsung are the best at talk to text. I don't have an Apple phone, so Samsung it is. Out of the Samsung watch models, the Samsung Galaxy Active 2 is the way to go in my opinion. I have the Bluetooth version, which has surprisingly good range and also comes with LTE capabilities. I can also answer phone calls while up on a ladder and talk through my watch. Again, that's not a feature on every smartwatch. That coupled with a rugged smartwatch protector like the Galaxy Watch Active 2 Unicorn Beetle Pro wristband case and a screen protector, it can handle some serious abuse. Thank you all for dispensing so much knowledge. I especially appreciate it when something is said, realize it needed to be corrected, and then the correction is shared in a later podcast. That's a sign of good people right there. Here for all your smartwatch needs, Ben K., Littleton, Mass. Thanks, Ben. What do you guys think? You convinced?
I love the 7-year-old in me has always wanted to be able to communicate to the world, through my watch. I think it was the Dick Tracy movie came out in the early 90s.
Before that, Andrew,
yeah.
it was a cartoon strip, I think, starting in the 50s or 60s. Am I right,
Yeah.
Mike? Yeah.
But I have like distinct memories of like seeing Dick Tracy's watch and being like, the future's here, 50 years
I
ago.
was surprised they don't all do that. My question is, like, what does it do if it doesn't do that?
Um, I sort of feel like the argument about like how expensive phones are or like a smartwatch is, like when you're comparing them to the rest of the tools you're using, um, is interesting. Like, I feel like maybe another solution is to have like your old phone on you or like a second SIM card or something. And but then it's like you get used to the technology of your new phone, and it makes you less effective at your job to use your old phone. But that was the only other idea I came up with of having a job site phone. How
If
did
folks
you all
have
communicate before there were smartphones on a job site?
So I entered the business when cell phones were, in their infancy, but still available. And, a year or two before the Habitat for Humanity affiliate I worked at had bought Motorola bag phones, which I'm sure Mike remembers, which was clunky, horrible, and awesome at the same time, right? It was just a life changer. Super expensive to make and use. Yeah.
Yeah, and before that, we had the original cellular phones were called car phones because they needed so much power. It had to be connected to your car battery. So we'd be up on a roof, you're setting roof trusses, and it was connected, interlocked with your horn in your vehicle. All of a sudden, the horn's honking, and somebody has to run down across the property to get to where the truck's parked. And fortunately, back then, there was no voicemail on the cell phones. So it would just ring until you answered or the person calling just gave up, figuring no one was going to pick up. Yeah.
I think if you didn't have that technology, and I'm sure Mike would agree it was expensive, is you used a payphone and maybe you'd call in once or twice a day. I had pagers too, in an effort to reduce some of the costs of the cell phone use, right? And then alphanumeric pagers, you could actually answer a question or send someone a phone number. And, that was a huge leap forward. It seems ridiculous now.
But even in the early 80s with those old car phones, it cost us between $1 and $1.50 per minute, which is, probably like a $5 bill today. But it saved us money and time because, one misorder or, a delivery that we're scheduling or whatever it happens to be, having that just, and we keep the conversation. It was like the telegraph. You wanted it really short and brief to the point. Delivery's not coming till tomorrow. Won't be there today. Okay, thank you. Bye. Down. But anyway, where we
No,
are
it's fun.
today is
And then I had a brick phone and then
Yeah.
flip phones, and oh man, it was great. This comes from Nick, more on smartphones. Hey guys, one of your listeners asked about smartwatches for trades, and I can't recommend my Garmin Instinct enough. I'm not in the trades, but it is held up to years of firefighting abuse. It doesn't have a touchscreen, but it displays all of my phone's notifications and only needs a charge every 2 or 3 weeks. If you spring for the solar version, you never have to charge it. I have a few issues with my house, and I think I found a solution to tackle them, but I'm hoping you guys will let me know if I'm way off. I live in Western Washington State. My house's main living area has cathedral ceilings and an open loft-style second floor where the master bedroom is located. Heating and cooling is taken care of by a 4-zone mini-split and a wood stove. My problems are, I have very cold floors in the winter. The mini-split is undersized to heat the main living area by itself. When and if we get the living area warm to a comfortable temperature, it's 1,000,000,000 degrees upstairs and it makes it impossible to sleep, mostly because all I can think of is how much hot air we're letting escape out our bedroom window. I will be installing a door to our bedroom soon enough to hopefully alleviate that one problem. It is also somewhat annoying to hear the mini-split blowing 24/7 in the cold months. I grew up splitting wood for our wood stove, and I'm over it, and I want to get rid of it. The uninsulated water lines run through the crawl space and are secured tight to the underside of the floor joist, so I don't think I can add pipe insulation. I think something like staple up radiant heating from Radiant Tech or something similar would solve all my problems. My thought is then, would I install some one by on the bottom of the joist so I can add a layer of rigid foam to the underside, thus bringing the water lines into the warm and insulated space? It's probably worth noting that when the furnace broke years ago, the previous owner decided not to replace it, and for unknown reason destroyed all the ductwork and left gaping holes where the registers used to connect to the ducts. I fixed those, but I'm not interested in installing another whole house dust blower / furnace. Thanks for reading. Love the podcast, Nick. Well, Nick, thanks for the thoughts on smartwatches. And what do you guys think about Nick's question? His house is cold. Sounds like he's got a poor insulated floor systems to start, right? And the pipes are on the outside, which seems like a big problem.
Well, it sounds like that the first floor is built over a crawl space. So the first thing comes to mind is, one, is a crawl space vented so there's cold air flowing through there? And then two, is there any insulation in those joist bays? Because both of those in combination could lead to cold floor problems, at least on the first floor.
Yeah, and before you fix that, you're going to have to bring the pipes into the thermal boundary, right? Because you can't have them outside the house, right, Andrew?
Yeah. Even when you think they're inside the house, they may function like they're outside the house.
So he talks about putting radiant floor in to warm the floor. I would start, and you could do it in stages. I would start with, if those water pipes are up against the underside or very close to the bottom of the floor sheathing, and you put thermal insulation, fluffy insulation below that, as long as those pipes are above the thermal insulation, they'll be not within maybe the air barrier of the floor, but they'll at least be on the warm side of the insulation. So it may not be a problem. All depends on where they're specifically located.
I think before he goes to the expense of installing, hydronic underfloor heating, doing the less expensive things of encapsulating your crawl space and air sealing it and insulating it is probably a good first step. And then that way, when you install your underfloor heating and find out it doesn't do everything you need it to, and go back and install the insulation, your heating isn't oversized, after you do all that insulation work.
I think you bring up a great point, Andrew. I think, Nick needs an energy audit. He mentions that the house is leaky through the top. It's clearly leaky through the bottom. What's going to have the biggest bang for the buck for his budget is something that I think needs to be researched with a blower door test and some thermography to see where the big holes are. Some things might be really easy to fix. He mentions ductwork and, disconnected ducts, which obviously there are holes left, are a huge source of energy loss oftentimes. So, maybe it's a matter of just plugging some of the biggest holes and the house will be way more comfortable to start. I think we're getting ahead of ourselves if we just go to insulating the floor and installing, a new heating system before fixing the envelope, which is likely has some problems based on his comfort complaints.
And once he gets to that and it does some energy improvements, he might find that, though he notes that the 4-zone mini split system isn't sized to handle the heating, that now it would be more than adequate and that it won't be, as he feels, running 24/7. I mean, it'll probably, the fans often will run on those indoor units all the time at a slow speed, but they're not running at a high speed and dumping a lot of heat into the space. It'd be just enough to meet the energy demand once the improvements are made.
Mike, one of the challenges with getting this work done is finding someone who does these kind of performance audits. Do you have any suggestions on how Nick might find someone in his area of Western Washington to do an energy audit on his house?
I'm actually familiar with a little further south in the Oregon area where they have I don't know if it's utility sponsored or state sponsored programs where they'll do free or low cost energy audits. But that would be my first place to check in Western Washington, is see if the local utility, be it electric and or gas, provides free or low cost energy audits. They may not do a blower door. A lot of the energy auditors will use sort of more of a checklist of just investigating typical air leaks, and they're familiar with the local building vernacular and how buildings were built in different periods, so they can almost target prescriptively areas of the house for both insulation and air sealing, depending on the design. Or the other way is to find if there are any ResNet or BPI certified folks in your immediate area. Sometimes some contractors in your area might be BPI certified or ResNet certified, and have them come out and do it. You might be worth a couple $100 to have a private energy audit done in the event that you can't find something that's either subsidized or free.
I think that would be money well spent. I really do. You don't want to spend a bunch of money on something that's not going to help or is going to help the wrong way.
Well, and looking at the fact that he has a cathedral ceiling, I'm betting it's not insulated particularly well, and so it just brought to mind the fact that he thought he could solve his problem through the floor and spending a few $1,000s, but re-insulating a cathedral ceiling is a much more disruptive project. And so it is that question of, again, how good is good enough? And are you okay just paying a bunch of extra money, for the next 30 years versus fixing it all right now?
I think it's important to keep in mind is something that Jeff Tooley, who's a home performance contractor, said to me one time. He's like, the more heat you make, if the house is leaky, it just leaks out faster. In the case study that I followed for Fine Homebuilding, this Victorian home in North Carolina, which isn't typically thought of as a cold place, had 4 heating plants, and the place was still freezing because every BTU of heat they made just leaked out of it, as soon as it was produced. So you have to solve the big holes first.
And one thing with that, I think the design of his house, where you've got that loft area, it's a 2-story vaulted ceiling with the loft. If you do air seal it really well and you get some decent insulation in there, right now he has a lot of temperature stratification between the lower floor and the upper floor, especially when you're using a wood stove, which is going to create a bit of convective looping, where a lot of that heat is going to, the warm air or the hot air is going to rise up into the top. If you block the leaks out and block the leaks in, you're not going to have as much stratification. So you'll find that upper level will be more in line in temperature with the lower level, maybe a 3 or 4 degree difference rather than maybe a 10 to 12 degree difference.
Jeff, you spent some time in rural areas of Vermont with vernacular architecture much like this. What's been your experience with the comfort of these buildings?
Like Mike was saying, it's with a lofted area, it's there's a lot of stratification. I mean, I have that in my house because I've got a big open area with a loft, and just a little bit of air sealing has made a huge difference. Because I could sit and just feel the cold air falling down on me, and doing that air sealing is all right. There's a little bit of a cool draft, but nothing like it used to be before I did the air sealing.
And my recollection was you mostly sealed can lights, right? Were there other measures you took?
I did can lights. I did some stuff in the basement. Just added extra weather stripping to the windows and things like that. So it was pretty low hanging fruit for the most part.
Oftentimes it is. Our colleague, Rodney Diaz, who's Fine Homebuilding's creative director, was mentioning that he recently put weather stripping on his garage door, which made a huge difference in the comfort of not just his basement area around his internal garage, but the rest of the house as well, because all the framing cavities in an old house connect together, and that air is not going to stay in the garage. It's going to go throughout the rest of the house. I should come clean, Mike. So this question was spawned by a query I had on a feature article you submitted for Fine Homebuilding on flashing a deck ledger. Do you want to talk about that?
So the article that'll be coming out, Andrew, do you know when that article will be coming out on flashing a deck ledger?
So it'll be in mailboxes mid-January. I think it goes live on
Oh,
the web
okay.
mid-January. So right around the corner.
Now, right?
Now, yeah.
Yeah.
Or pretty soon, yeah. So it was one of the things in the article. So we won't. I won't get into the flashing, but one of the when articles get worked through the system, like I as an author will write something, and then it goes to an editor there, and then other editors put eyes on it just to make sure that something isn't slipping through the cracks, an obvious ill-advised process or obviously problematic
Or questions
statement.
that are unanswered, right? Like this, what question might a reader have that we
That
haven't
too.
addressed in
Yeah.
this piece is often what the extra eyes are for.
And Patrick asked the question, well, if we're going to put aluminum flashing over the ledger, is there a problem of galvanic reaction when you drive screws through the decking and then through that aluminum flashing, figuring that those screws are going to be somewhat carbon steel based? They might be galvanized and they might have an epoxy or ceramic coating on them. And then it just triggered this thought that, yeah, that galvanic reaction ends up being a problem that a lot of contractors think about, and they may not always have the right information. And I look through a lot of my old questions that have come into me over the years from readers that I get directly, and this was one that kind of stuck up, so I sent it over as a question to the podcast.
You were kind. You let me off the hook.
Well, but your question is the one that a lot of thoughtful contractors have. And that's what it comes down to. Contractors that are thinking, well, I don't want to put dissimilar metals together because something's going to corrode, it's going to be a problem. And it's good to think those things through and then have an answer. So you want me to read this? You want to read it, Patrick?
Well, so yeah, I'll read
Or,
it.
okay.
So he says, Mike says, I bend up my own flashing for window caps, step flashing, skirt boards, and deck ledgers, and others out of colored aluminum coil stock. One of the guys on our crew, Patrick, questioned my use of galvanized nails, roofing, or trim style to fasten the flashings. He pointed out that the galvanic reaction between the dissimilar metals, aluminum and zinc, will result in corrosion of the aluminum. I'm aware of galvanic reactions, but thought in order for it to occur, there needed to be moving water. I always fasten the flashing as high as possible where the nails will be covered by the siding or roofing or trim. What is the risk of the galvanic reaction in typical siding and roofing, trim and flashing situations? And what, if anything, should I do to better avoid a flashing compatibility/durability problem? So the risk is that when you have copper and zinc materials, when they're in the presence of water, they corrode, right? They exchange ions, and what I've seen happen is like the aluminum disappears, right?
Yep, exactly. And depending on, so you can look online for a galvanic chart, and it'll show you which metals are close together in proximity on the chart and which are further apart. The further apart they are from the anodic or cathodic portion of the upper and lower ends of the chart, the more, when you put them together, you'll get that ionic reaction. Ions are just parts of the molecule that are kind of flowing between each other. There's a little electrical charge going on there. The closer together they are, the less reactive they are. And like you mentioned, galvanization, which is zinc, is very close. The zinc is very close to aluminum. So there's not a lot of ionic flow between the two of them, which is going to exacerbate the corrosion problem. And in any case, you do need to have moisture as an electrolyte. And not that pure water is an electrolyte, but it has minerals in it which form that electrolyte, kind of like a battery does when you have a lead acid battery. The electrolyte is the acid in the fluid acid. So if you don't have water, like with roofing and siding, if you don't have water getting to the connections of those two different metals, and those two metals like aluminum and a galvanized nail or galvanized screw, you're not going to have much of a problem. Where we do have problems is where you see metal hardware, where it's a galvanized piece joist hanger, and somebody happens to use stainless steel nails. Now, stainless steel is very far apart on the galvanic chart from galvanized steel, and therefore you're going to get corrosion of that galvanized steel. So in the case of deck ledgers, where the screw might be going through the ledger flashing from the decking above, very little chance of significant corrosion where you're going to get leaking through that flashing. And the same with step flashing and other flashings on roofs and walls. Now, all that said, when you get close to salt water, you're going to get more pronounced corrosion, but that's more due to the salt water and salt in the air than it is due to the galvanic reaction. Now, I'm sure some of our listeners will have a lot of feedback on this, particularly the corrosion engineers of our listeners, and they might be able to fill in some of the blanks that we've left here.
What I've seen is cheap aluminum flashing, unpainted, the mill finish, and the new copper, and I say new, they're not new anymore, but the copper-based preservatives, like that stuff quickly disappeared in the presence of water. I've seen it just looks like Swiss cheese. And it seems to be less of a problem if you have painted coil stock, right?
But it's still a problem.
It's still a problem.
And one of the things that anybody's familiar with dielectric unions that we use in plumbing, where you're actually separating the different metals that make up our plumbing pipes to, say, a water heater or a boiler, and there's a plastic washer in there. And what we do with deck ledgers, which will be part of the article, is we put some peel and stick over the top of the ledger board. The ledger board has copper in the preservatives, pressure-treated lumber. And then when I use aluminum flashing, now I've put in an isolation membrane. Is essentially that peel and stick's doing two things. It's sort of a backup to our primary metal flashing, but it's also a dielectric union. It's separating the two dissimilar metals, the copper in the wood and the aluminum flashing.
Chemistry is so cool.
It is. You never thought when you learned it in high school and it wasn't sinking in, you never thought it would ever be of use to you. But then here we are building houses, and now that chemistry comes into to good use, at least in understanding what's going on behind and why we're building what we're building, the way we're building.
Do you think it makes sense to similarly wrap pressure-treated framing material before putting it in joist hangers as an example to make that separation? Yeah, you're nodding your head.
Yeah, we did an article back in 2007, one of my deck framing articles, and we talked specifically about using an isolation membrane, because that was right after 2007 was right after that changeover from the CCA treated lumber to the ACQ and MCQ and all the more copper heavy pressure treated processes. And 2003-4 was when they made the changeover, and then shortly thereafter, within a couple of years, that's when the Swiss cheese aluminum. We started realizing, oops, this isn't the old CCA lumber, which was pretty non-reactive to flashing, aluminum in particular.
I bet you that caught a bunch of people by surprise.
Yeah. Where are the other places in our building envelope you should be paying attention to these reactions? Like, what are some other common scenarios?
The one I see the most is whenever you use stainless steel fasteners, whether it's for attaching hardware or it's attaching, say you've got an aluminum aluminum clad window with aluminum flanges, and you just say, oh, I'm going to use stainless steel screws because stainless is great. But now you're driving those screws in. When you get using stainless or copper fasteners with aluminum or galvanized steel, anything, hardware or window frames and so on. That's where
so if you're going to use stainless steel fasteners, you got to spring for the stainless steel windows.
Or go for the bargain basement, the PVC windows.
Sure, yeah.
Then you don't have a problem. Plastic and metal, there's no problem.
The irony is someone is sure they're doing something, doing a good job, right? Is they're opting for a corrosion-proof fastener, and exactly. Most of the time it is. This comes from Joe in Laurel, Delaware. Evening FHB podcast. A friend of mine has found an interesting issue in his attic along the gable wall. While investigating his dryer vent problems, perhaps a story for another time, he noticed his sheathing along the truss and some of the roof plywood was discolored. While I haven't been able to see the property myself or the flashing, I have a concern that the masonry wall may be in direct contact with the gable wall. I think he's talking about a masonry chimney, right? He's talking about masonry chimney is in contact with the gable wall. I don't have a reference to what code was in 2004 when the house was built, much less which code was applicable in 2004. However, compared to my 2018 book, they recommend a minimum of 1-inch air gap as a clearance to combustibles. In his situation, our 1003.18 plus exemption 3 would apply. Anywho, this leads me to some questions. Chapter 10 of the IRC leaves out any specifics or circular references to another chapter, namely Chapter 7, with the exception of masonry veneer chimneys, which is this is not. I would defer to at least the same requirements as the WRB system behind a veneer wall, less the ledger and weep hole requirements, but this puts me in a tailspin. Is there a code on a WRB between the chimney and wood-based sheathing? Code or not, what is the moisture mitigation procedure for a seldom used fireplace? If moisture did accumulate, where does it diffuse to? Where can it diffuse to? How do you diffuse it and maintain fire blocking? If his problem is in fact moisture between the chimney and the wall, is there mitigation possible without removing or replacing the chimney? The gable truss may complicate a from the back approach. Where might I find some resource to learn about masonry fireplaces and chimneys more? In the tight envelope world, this juncture would be even more important to get right. Our climate 4A, so it's awfully moist year-round. Thanks for any input. I've enjoyed the podcast very much. While I've seen a lot as a remodeler, this one has me a little perplexed on how to handle other than inspecting the flashing and wall. Fortunately, it's not my job, or at least not yet anyway, so it's more of a curiosity for me. I used to spend my summers in the Adirondacks and some winters in Jeffersonville, Vermont. I've been to Stowe, Vermont, and find the peculiarities of that area so interesting, especially since I've never seen a witch's window on my side of the notch. That's to mention that I love New England's diversity and nuances in local older construction. My apologies if this has gotten a bit long-winded, but thanks anyway. Well, that was cool. Okay. So he's got a masonry chimney, a brick chimney on the gable end of this building, and he wants to know, is it possible that the brick chimney is built right on the wood sheathing? What do you think, Mike?
Well, let's back up a step. He did send us some photos, and you described the situation. And in one of the photos of the inside, it looks like the attic, and it's sort of a shot looking up at the roof sheathing where it meets the wall. And that section of wall is right behind where the chimney would be. So above that, and when you look at that union between the roof sheathing and the wall sheathing, it shows staining, but it even shows staining to the point where it looks like it's saturated. The wood is saturated. And then below that, the wall sheathing looks like it has a little bit of mold or something on it. So my first thought is the step flashing to the chimney is probably leaking. So first thing is, if you think you have a water problem, find the water. That's going to solve 99% of your problem. So somebody's got to get up there on the roof and look at that flashing and make sure there's no water getting in.
Maybe hit it with a hose, right?
You can hit it with a hose, but one of the problems going to be, even if you hit it with a hose, it could take hours or days before you might see extra water coming through on the roof sheathing. So it's really just it's sort of an experienced eye looking at the flashing and sort of peeling back the layers and going, oh, you can see the little trails of debris where water is traveled in, bulk water. Because this isn't just like an occasional weep coming in. It looked like a fair amount of water. So that would be my starting point. Somebody's got to get eyes up on the roof, somebody who knows what they're doing, and solve that problem. As far as the space between the chimney and the wall, it's probably there. There is a 1-inch space between the back of the block that's underneath the brick veneer on the chimney. But usually what they'll do when they veneer the brick around the face of the chimney and return it to the walls, they'll bridge that space between the void of the cinder block or the concrete block and the sheathing. Now, that's not a code issue. That's just like your trim meeting the wall. There's probably always going to be a little bit of water getting in there, but most of the times when a house is framed, that chimney goes up after the wall has already been, hopefully, the water resistor barrier. So my guess is there's already a water resistor barrier back there with same water resistor barrier behind the siding. And that because of the way the step flashing is done, the water is actually getting behind the house wrap or the WRB, which is behind the chimney. So again, once you solve that leak problem up top, there's not much you can do about that WRB because there's no retrofit for that kind of thing without
You're taking the chimney off, right?
you're
That's the
taking the
only
chimney
solution,
off.
yeah.
Exactly. And as far as that moisture that might be in there now getting out, at least in the attic, it can move through the OSB into the attic, dry from the roof sheathing into the attic. And then the masonry fireplace itself, that masonry will allow moisture to move through it in vapor form. So you've got good drying potential in both sides up in the attic area. What is happening where the living space wall is below that, we don't know. There actually could be some decay going on, but until somebody tears the chimney down, you're not going to know. And my guess is there probably isn't. There might be gotten a little bit of moisture down there. And in that case, once you solve the leak problem, that moisture that might be between the wall and the chimney will eventually find its way out because it wants to equalize with the outdoor environment.
I was going to suggest it might be wise to have someone who knows masonry to have a look at this chimney and make sure it's not failing in other ways. The crown could be a source of moisture intrusion. If it's not venting, the huge amounts of water vapor that could be coming up from there could be creating a problem, somewhere in the, along its length. So I would have someone check that out. I think it's probably a flashing issue, right?
Yep.
Andrew, Jeff, thoughts on this?
I'm just studying the picture, and it looks very clearly like the up corner of that roof sheathing is like fully saturated and decaying, which it's like if your hypothesis is something is wrong with the chimney, you're probably focused on the wall. But if your hypothesis is there's water getting in from above, which seems like a more likely situation, as soon as you start looking for those warning signs, it's sort of like it's like making sure you're asking the right questions versus just making some assumptions.
And that's important. I did an Instagram post a couple weeks ago about jumping to conclusions in a toilet repair I was working on. And very frequently when we see, like in the case of Joe, he talks to his friend who sent him these pictures and he jumps to the conclusion and his mind starts going like, oh my gosh, if this is happening, then maybe there's a problem with this. And what was the code and how is this assembled? So he starts thinking down a path, which could be the right answer and lead you in the right direction or could be the wrong direction. And we're doing the same kind of thing. We're presuming the leak could be at the flashing. But Patrick, as you pointed out, the cap of that fireplace, and when you mentioned it, it got me thinking, yeah, water could be flowing down between the flue pipe and the cap because sometimes that concrete seal there isn't really good. And if it flows down and they didn't do a good job with their flashing internally when they ran the counter flashing out, water could be weeping out in towards the wall, depending on how the brick and the block are laid out. So that's where eyes on the spot, be it a mason evaluating that or a roofer or just a general all-around person who can track where that water is going by destructive investigation.
Joe, this is a perfect opportunity to buy a drone. You're going to fly that thing up there. You're going to be able to get a firsthand look, and you're going to be able to write it off on your taxes.
The only other thing I noticed in the picture is it looks like there are a handful of nails that have missed the truss on that gable end. I'm assuming that likely is not related to this at all.
It might be an indication of the person doing the work was, in a hurry.
Sure.
This comes from Tim. I'll try and get through this quick here. Tim says, "Hello, FHB podcast team. Kudos on maintaining a credible, fun, and useful platform. I look forward to listening to each new episode, even more when none of the topics catch my eye. I've seen lots of statements about interior air barriers. None seem to apply to my situation. I'm converting the loft of a garage to an ADU. The space has a 24 by 36 footprint with full pitch roof, with the ADU fully occupying the loft space. Entrances from outside on the gable end. I am in the Northeast Connecticut, so I think it's zone 5 with both heating and cooling seasons. I expect this space may be unoccupied for extended periods. The roof is metal over 2x4 purlins held by 2x10 rafters on 24-inch centers. I created a vent channel with perforated foil under the metal roof, followed by fiberglass in the base, all covered by foil face rigid insulation on the bottom and taped at the seams. The end walls is where my question comes in. The framing here is 1x6-inch rough sawn pine, sawn on site studs and purlins, mostly mounted horizontally on 24-inch centers to receive the 1x rough sawn pine exterior, vertical sheathing / siding, also cut from the site. Overlapping horizontal courses of 30-pound felt were attached to the exterior of this framing as a rain screen before the vertical pine. Even without the planned battens, this was fine and adequately weatherproof for a garage / storage area for the last 20 years. I'm intending to cover the vertical pine with bevel cedar siding as part of the ADU finishing, so the planned wall stack-up would look like this. From the outside in, he's talking about bevel / lap cedar siding, vertical pine, 30-pound felt paper, fiberglass bats, an air barrier. This is where my question lies. Vertical TNG pine on the interior finish. It seems like some kind of vapor permeable air barrier would be appropriate, especially with loose tongue and groove as the interior finish. So I'm going to get right to the point here. Tim needs an air barrier on the interior. Am I right? Yeah, we're all nodding. And the reason for that is why? Because the boards are terrible as an air barrier, and we know from our discussion about winter outerwear that we need some way to stop the air movement to keep this space comfortable. So what's our suggestion for an air barrier with this wall stack up? Jeff, you want to lead us off? What's your choice?
I'm thinking it's got to be some sort of a smart membrane.
Jeff's going smart membrane at $1 a square foot. Okay. Mike, you got
Yep, that's one option. Another option is just drywall. Just tape the drywall.
Andrew, you got a suggestion?
I was thinking Intello.
Intello. I think any of those things would be great. Thermoply, Mike, it's like cardboard, shiny cardboard. Mm-hmm. Can you use that as an interior material, Mike?
You can use just about anything. You can use rigid foam for that matter.
Yeah.
It's any material that's going to block the air. The important thing here, and it's good that he's thinking about this, that Tim's thinking about this, because I've done investigations on homes built like this where they did not, but they put in that tongue and groove or shiplap wall finish on the inside with no air barrier, and there are all kinds of moisture problems, air leaks through the wall, and so on. So air barrier continuous, and you got to make sure you seal it at the lowest level, and then you've got Tim has that polyiso foil face, I guess, up on the roof. He's got to somehow seal whatever the air barrier materials is up to that before you put any sealing or wall finish on. So it's continuous all the way around the interior, and any penetrations, electrical boxes and so on, seal around those so it's airtight as best as possible.
Canadians have used interior poly for this application for a long time, and detailed correctly, I think that's a fine system. So I think it's about your budget, Tim. I think drywall's the best way because honestly, it's a great fireproofing strategy. It makes the house quieter because of its mass, and it's cheap. So what's not to like? And it doesn't have to be pretty. It just has to be fire taped, and then you put the paneling on top of it, right? Wow, good show. Who wants to talk about what we're going to talk about in our after show to remind listeners?
So I'm happy to talk about it, even though it was Mike's idea. He As we balance our resources when we're doing projects or we're doing projects for other people, the question of how good is good enough, especially when we have exacting craftsmanship standards, how good is good enough, and how do you make that decision and balance those priorities so you aren't thinking about rerunning your plumbing over your holiday break.
A third time.
And of course, if you want to listen to the after show, all you have to do is become a member of the Fine Homebuilding community. All of our after shows are hosted on our website behind our member paywall, but you get to hear sort of the real talk from everyone on the podcast about all kinds of crazy topics, including how good is good enough. So I'm looking forward to talking through that with you guys.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Gall. And those of you who are All Access memberships, stay tuned for the podcast. And I want to thank you very much for helping us keep the lights on here and doing the important work of Fine Home Building and helping you do a good job building houses. So stay tuned for the after show. How good is good enough? I think it probably is going to be a great conversation because we had a little initial discussion yesterday, and I think it's fun. Well, that is all the time we have today. Thanks very much for listening, and thanks to Mike, Andrew, and Jeff for joining me. Please remember to send us your comments, questions, and suggestions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com. And please, 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 please like, comment, or review us however you're listening. It helps other folks on our podcast. And tell your friends, everybody. We need to have more listeners to the podcast. Thanks for being here.